Human beings live with a paradox. On one side, we are fully aware of our mortality, unlike any other species. On the other, we constantly try to forget this awareness in order to live. Irvin D. Yalom, in Existential Psychotherapy, points out that death is not simply a distant event awaiting us at the end of life, but rather a presence that shadows every decision, every value, and every attempt at meaning. He writes, "Though the physicality of death destroys us, the idea of death saves us. It is this paradoxical duality, the terror of annihilation and the liberation that comes from confronting it, that silently shapes our inner world. Most of us rarely speak about death directly. We build an invisible wall around it, as if silence could neutralize its power. Yet beneath that silence, death anxiety seeps into our behavior. Consider how much of human ambition, whether pursuing success, accumulating wealth, or striving for legacy, is an attempt to defy the finality of death. Sigmund Freud described this in his theory of repression. What cannot be faced directly is pushed into the unconscious, where it resurfaces in disguised forms. Death, repressed, becomes a phantom that haunts dreams, anxieties, and even the way we love. We cling desperately to others, fearing abandonment, when at the root of that fear is the ultimate abandonment, the certainty that time will separate us from everything we know. Yalom illustrates this hidden influence through countless patients who enter therapy not declaring, "I am afraid of death," but rather presenting symptoms of anxiety, depression, or a sense of emptiness. Slowly, as the therapeutic dialogue unfolds, the fear of death begins to reveal itself as the silent architect behind their suffering. The fear does not always take the form of panic about dying tomorrow. It is more subtle, more pervasive, a gnawing sense of urgency, a restless hunger for significance, or an unexplained dread that surfaces in the stillness of night. Other thinkers have echoed this. Ernest Becker, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, argued that all culture is essentially a defense mechanism against mortality. Civilization, he wrote, is built upon immortality projects, systems of belief, achievement, and meaning that help us feel we will somehow outlast our own biological end. Religion offers heaven, nations offer glory, art promises legacy, even family lines become a symbolic continuity against the void. Becker insisted that without the specter of death, human beings would not have built the vast structures of culture and identity we now take for granted. But there is a cost to this denial. By avoiding the confrontation with death, we live inauthentically. Heidegger, the German existential philosopher, described this as living in the mode of das Man, the anonymous they, who live by routine and convention. In such a state, one's life is not truly one's own. It is borrowed from the expectations of others. Death, when repressed, creates not freedom, but conformity, a desperate attempt to escape the anxiety it produces. And yet, as Yalom often reminds his readers and his patients, the awareness of death is not merely a source of despair. When brought into the light, when spoken about openly and faced directly, it can transform us. Many of his patients, after confronting their mortality in the wake of illness or loss, discovered a renewed intensity for living. They no longer postponed love or creativity. They no longer lived as if tomorrow were guaranteed. Instead, they began to savor the fragile, fleeting moments of existence with a sense of urgency that was no longer fear-driven, but life-affirming. Consider the patient Yalom describes in Staring at the Sun. She was an elderly woman who had long been immobilized by the thought of death. Therapy did not remove her fear entirely, nor could it, but it reframed it. By acknowledging it, by daring to say aloud the unspeakable, she found herself free to pursue what mattered to her: connection, beauty, and small acts of courage. Death, as Yalom writes, became a boundary situation that revealed what was most essential in her life. The unspoken fear, then, is not a curse, but a hidden teacher. It pushes us, often unconsciously, to seek safety in illusions and distraction. But when we finally bring it into the open, it teaches us that life is finite, precious, and not to be wasted. To live authentically is to live with death as a constant shadow, not to deny it, but to let its presence illuminate the path ahead. In this sense, death is not only the end of life, but also the silent force that gives life its urgency, its intensity, and its irreplaceable meaning. If death is the shadow that follows us, then denial is the shield we carry to keep from seeing it. Human beings, as Irvin D. Yalom insists in existential psychotherapy, are perhaps unique in their capacity to know they will die, and equally unique in their relentless strategies to avoid that knowledge. Denial of death is not merely an occasional trick of the mind. It is woven into the very fabric of culture, daily life, and even our individual identities. To live without some form of denial would mean facing every sunrise with the unbearable weight of finitude. And thus, distraction and illusion are not accidents, but strategies of survival. Sigmund Freud was among the first to suggest that repression of death anxiety plays a central role in psychic life. In his essay, Thoughts for the Times on War and Death, Freud observed that despite being surrounded by mortality, humans behave as though they were immortal. He argued that the unconscious mind does not truly register death in a personal sense. It treats death as something that happens to others. This mechanism allows us to function without paralysis, but it also creates a split. Consciously, we know we are mortal. Unconsciously, we proceed as if we are exempt. This split fuels countless distractions. In modern society, consumerism is one of the most visible. Advertising is saturated with promises of youth, beauty, and vitality, subtle messages that whisper of escape from decay. Plastic surgery, anti-aging products, extreme fitness regimes, each carries with it an implicit denial. If I can preserve the body, perhaps I can cheat death. But these attempts are only temporary shields. Beneath the surface, the anxiety remains. Yalom often notes that patients who obsess about aging are rarely just afraid of wrinkles. They are terrified of what wrinkles signify, that time is running out. Ernest Becker, in The Denial of Death, took this idea further. He claimed that nearly all human endeavor is built upon immortality projects, efforts to outlast biological death through symbolic means. These projects range from creating works of art to accumulating wealth to contributing to science or religion. At their heart lies a common desire to leave a trace that endures beyond one's lifespan. Becker saw culture itself as an elaborate defense system, shielding individuals from the abyss of non-existence. Nations, myths, monuments, each provides the illusion of permanence in a world where nothing truly lasts. Religious traditions, of course, have historically provided the most powerful forms of denial. By promising an afterlife, they transform death from an end into a transition. Whether through heaven, reincarnation, or spiritual continuation, religion softens the brutal finality of mortality. Yalom acknowledges this function without dismissing its value. He notes that for many patients, faith provides real comfort, yet he also observes that when belief falters, individuals are often left more exposed than ever, struggling to fill the void once held by certainty. But denial does not always appear in such grand forms. Sometimes it emerges quietly in the way we schedule our days. Endless busyness, compulsive productivity, or constant scrolling through screens, all are modern methods of keeping death at bay by keeping stillness away. For it is in stillness that mortality creeps back into consciousness. Yalom recounts how many of his patients confessed that their deepest dread surfaced at night when distractions fell away. The silence of darkness became unbearable precisely because it mirrored the silence they feared awaited them in death. Yet denial, however universal, is never absolute. Moments of crisis puncture the shield. Illness, accidents, and the death of loved ones force individuals to confront what they would rather avoid. In such moments, the illusions of immortality collapse. Becker argued that these ruptures are both terrifying and necessary. They strip away the protective layers of denial, leaving individuals face to face with reality. The question then becomes, will one retreat again into distraction, or will one use the confrontation as a turning point toward authenticity? Yalom describes this in Staring at the Sun as the awakening effect of mortality. He insists that while denial is useful, too much of it suffocates life. Living entirely in illusions of immortality prevents us from experiencing the richness of existence. Death, paradoxically, gives life its urgency. Without it, there would be no reason to prioritize love, no need to create art, no hunger for transcendence. Denial protects us, but if clung to too tightly, it also robs us of depth. One striking example comes from Yalom's clinical work with cancer patients. Many of them reported that once the denial collapsed, they felt an unexpected surge of clarity. One man confessed that his diagnosis, while devastating, had also freed him. He no longer wasted time on trivial pursuits. He called his illness a brutal gift. The collapse of illusion had allowed him to live more vividly than ever before. The illusion of immortality is thus both a curse and a blessing. It allows us to function, but it risks blinding us to life's brevity. Perhaps the challenge, as Yalom suggests, is not to abandon denial entirely, but to balance it with moments of honest confrontation. To look into the shadow now and then, to acknowledge the truth without letting it destroy us. For it is in this balance between denial and confrontation that human beings find their most authentic way of being. There is a difference between knowing that we will die and feeling that truth in the marrow of our being. For much of life, death remains an abstraction, a distant concept reserved for the old, the sick, or the unlucky. But there are moments when mortality ceases to be a philosophical idea and becomes personal. These moments, what Yalom calls boundary experiences, pierce through the veil of denial and shake us awake. They arrive in many forms: a diagnosis, the sudden loss of a loved one, a car accident that could have ended differently. In these moments, the shadow of death steps out from behind us and stands directly in front of us, undeniable and unyielding. Irvin D. Yalom often emphasizes that such awakenings are not only moments of terror, but also moments of possibility. In Staring at the Sun, he recalls how patients who faced near-death experiences often emerged with profound transformations in their outlook on life. One patient, after surviving a heart attack, told him, "Everything is the same, and yet nothing is the same." The routines of life remained, but their meaning had shifted. What once felt urgent, career ambitions, minor conflicts, social appearances, suddenly seemed trivial. What had been neglected, intimacy, creativity, gratitude, now glowed with importance. This shift echoes the insights of Martin Heidegger, who argued that authentic existence arises only when we confront our being toward death. For Heidegger, death is not an event at the end of life, but a condition that defines life itself. Most people, he argued, live in inauthenticity, distracted by routines and conventions. But when one faces mortality directly, authenticity becomes possible. The confrontation strips away illusions, forcing us to acknowledge our finite time and to live it as our own. Yalom's clinical practice confirms this existential truth. He describes patients who, after receiving a terminal diagnosis, felt strangely liberated. The countdown forced them to re-examine priorities. One woman, who had spent decades sacrificing her desires for others, finally gave herself permission to live differently. She traveled, she painted, she allowed herself to love again. Death, once her greatest fear, became the very thing that returned her to life. Yet, awakening is not always gentle. Often it arrives with the force of trauma. The loss of a parent, for example, can shatter the illusion that those who protect us are immortal. The death of a peer reminds us that mortality is not confined to the elderly. Even the simple act of crossing a hospital corridor, smelling antiseptic and hearing distant cries, can collapse the protective layers of denial. Such moments feel unbearable precisely because they strip us of innocence. But Yalom insists that within this terror lies the seed of transformation. Ernest Becker would have agreed. In The Denial of Death, he argued that people often build their lives on what he called immortality projects. When those projects collapse in the face of mortality, when one realizes that legacy, wealth, or reputation cannot protect against the void, one is forced to reckon with the fragility of existence. This reckoning, though painful, is also a gateway to authenticity. Without it, one remains trapped in illusions. With it, one can finally embrace life in its raw, fleeting beauty. Consider how survivors of disasters often speak of a before and after. Before, life was automatic. After, every moment was charged with intensity. A cup of coffee, a sunrise, the touch of a loved one. All are experienced with an urgency that had been absent before. Yalom notes that this intensity does not come from ignoring death, but from living alongside it, acknowledging it as a constant companion. But awakening to mortality is not a one-time event. Like waves, the realization comes and recedes. People may experience a profound awakening after a crisis, only to slip back into denial as daily life resumes. Yalom reminds us that this oscillation is natural. We cannot live in constant confrontation with death. It would overwhelm us. But neither should we bury the awareness completely. The task is to revisit it periodically, to allow mortality to recalibrate our compass without paralyzing us. For therapists, guiding patients through such awakenings requires delicacy. Yalom stresses that the role of the therapist is not to remove the fear, since no one can truly erase it, but to help the patient live with it. By naming the fear, by speaking openly about death, the patient learns that they are not alone in their confrontation. The shadow becomes less suffocating when shared. The awakening, then, is not about despair, but about clarity. It strips away the superficial and returns us to the essential. As Yalom beautifully puts it, though the idea of death may fill us with terror, it also has the power to fill us with vitality. When mortality becomes personal, we are reminded that our days are limited, our choices finite, and our opportunities fragile. But within that fragility lies the possibility of living fully, authentically, and with gratitude. When people dare to look at death not as an enemy to be denied, but as a mirror reflecting back the truth of existence, life itself changes form. The awareness of finitude strips away the illusions that clutter our vision and forces us to ask the most fundamental question: what truly matters? Irvin D. Yalom has long argued that death, paradoxically, is not just an end, but a teacher. In existential psychotherapy, he insists that the confrontation with death and with the givens of existence can give rise to a more authentic mode of being. Death, then, is a mirror in which life's priorities are clarified, often with startling intensity. Martin Heidegger's philosophy echoes this idea with precision. For him, death is not merely the last event in life, but the defining horizon of existence. In his monumental work, Being and Time, he speaks of being toward death as the fundamental condition of human life. It is by recognizing our inevitable death that we come to see life as limited and thus urgent. Without the shadow of death, there is no reason to distinguish between what is trivial and what is essential. To live authentically, one must live with death as a constant reflection, an ever-present mirror showing us who we are and how we choose to spend our fleeting time. Yalom illustrates this in his clinical practice. He describes patients who, upon confronting their mortality, often undergo a radical shift in values. One businessman, after a cancer diagnosis, realized that his relentless pursuit of wealth had left him spiritually impoverished. In therapy, he confessed that the thought of leaving behind financial empires brought him no peace. What mattered now were his relationships, the laughter of his children, and the quiet moments he had too often sacrificed. Death had held up a mirror, revealing not only the futility of his illusions, but also the urgency of what he had neglected. The same transformation can occur outside the clinic. Survivors of disasters, soldiers returning from war, or ordinary individuals facing close encounters with death often describe a similar reordering of meaning. Small irritations, traffic jams, petty rivalries, superficial status symbols lose their grip. In their place rises a hunger for presence, the desire to live each day as though it truly matters because it does. Death becomes the silent instructor that reveals the value of life by reminding us that it is finite. But this mirror is not easy to face. As Ernest Becker argued in The Denial of Death, most of human culture is designed precisely to avoid this confrontation. We create immortality projects, build legacies, chase fame or power, all in the hope of escaping the reflection. Yet, when the illusions collapse, when denial can no longer hold, we are left with the raw truth. Our lives are brief, fragile, and ultimately bounded by death. In this collapse lies the possibility of awakening. For once illusions dissolve, authenticity becomes possible. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and founder of logotherapy, offered another perspective on this mirror. In man's search for meaning, he observed that even in the most inhumane conditions, where death was omnipresent, individuals could find meaning by choosing their attitude. Death did not strip life of meaning, it demanded that meaning be created. Frankl believed that awareness of finitude compels us to take responsibility for our choices. Because life is short, every moment counts. Because time is finite, each decision carries weight. The mirror of death sharpens the contours of existence, forcing us to act deliberately rather than drifting passively. Yalom builds upon this idea by emphasizing the therapeutic power of openly discussing death. He describes how patients who learn to face their mortality often develop a renewed vitality. They become less preoccupied with the judgment of others, more willing to pursue passions, and more able to embrace intimacy. The mirror of death reflects back not only our fragility but also our freedom. It reminds us that we are the authors of our lives, responsible for what we make of the time we have. Still, the temptation to look away is strong. It is easier to drown in distractions than to stare into the mirror of finitude. But those who dare to look discover that the reflection is not empty. Death reveals meaning precisely because it limits us. Without death, life would stretch endlessly, and its moments would lose urgency. With death, every choice matters, every encounter has weight, and every act of love becomes irreplaceable. In the end, the mirror of death does not show us darkness, it shows us clarity. It reminds us that the clock is ticking and that each day, each hour is an opportunity to live fully. Yalom summarizes this beautifully when he writes, "The fact of death is the source of life's sweetness." By looking into the mirror, by daring to see what we would rather avoid, we are not condemned to despair, but invited into authenticity. Death reflects back the truth of life, that it is fragile, precious, and meaningful only when we choose to live it consciously. When a patient walks into a therapist's office, they rarely begin by saying, "I am afraid of death." The fear is almost always disguised, woven into symptoms of anxiety, depression, relational struggles, or an elusive sense of emptiness. Yet Irvin D. Yalom argues in Existential Psychotherapy that beneath many psychological conflicts, there lies a confrontation with the ultimate boundary, finitude. Therapy, in this sense, becomes more than the treatment of symptoms. It becomes a dialogue at the edge of existence, where the silence of death, usually avoided in everyday conversation, can finally be spoken aloud. For centuries, psychotherapy largely sidestepped death. Freud himself admitted that death anxiety was a profound force in human life, yet he often framed it through the lens of repression and displacement, rather than as a central theme of therapy. Later, behaviorists and cognitive therapists treated symptoms without entering into existential questions. It was the existential school, with thinkers like Yalom, Rollo May, and Viktor Frankl, that brought mortality to the foreground. They insisted that therapy must not only address how people think and behave, but also how they confront the ultimate givens of existence: freedom, isolation, meaninglessness, and death. Yalom's clinical stories demonstrate how transformative it can be to bring death out of hiding. In Staring at the Sun, he describes patients immobilized by a nameless dread that, when explored, revealed itself as death anxiety. One patient confessed that her panic attacks always struck in moments of quiet, when she felt the weight of impermanence pressing in. By naming death directly, by speaking the unspeakable, she discovered that the terror lost some of its paralyzing power. Yalom insists that what is most feared must be brought into dialogue, otherwise it festers in the unconscious, shaping life from the shadows. The role of the therapist in such encounters is not to provide false reassurance. Death cannot be eliminated, postponed indefinitely, or explained away. Instead, the therapist becomes a companion, a fellow human being who also lives under the shadow of finitude. Yalom often stresses that the therapist's authenticity is essential. Patients can sense when the therapist is avoiding the subject or hiding behind intellectual distance. It is only when the therapist dares to acknowledge their own mortality, their own vulnerability, that true dialogue can emerge. Therapy at the edge of existence requires courage from both parties. One of Yalom's central insights is that confronting death in therapy often liberates rather than destroys. Many patients, after acknowledging their mortality, report a renewed sense of vitality. A woman who had lived cautiously, always waiting for the right moment to pursue her dreams, realized through therapy that the right moment would never come. Time itself was slipping away. With this awareness, she finally allowed herself to take risks, to love openly, and to embrace creativity. The confrontation with death did not paralyze her. It freed her from illusions that had held her captive. This liberation echoes Viktor Frankl's emphasis on meaning. In Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl described how even in the death camps, where mortality was omnipresent, those who could find meaning in suffering were more resilient. For Frankl, therapy at the edge of existence meant helping patients discover or create meaning in the face of inevitable death. Yalom shares this view, though he adds that meaning need not be cosmic or eternal. It can be found in relationships, in acts of kindness, in creativity, and in the sheer act of being present. Therapy at the edge of existence also challenges the cultural taboos surrounding death. In many societies, death is hidden from view. The dying are isolated in hospitals, funerals are sanitized rituals, and conversations about mortality are avoided. This cultural silence intensifies individual anxiety. By providing a space where death can be spoken of openly, therapy becomes countercultural. It restores death to its rightful place in human reflection. Patients often describe a sense of relief, even gratitude, when they discover that their fear is not unique, but shared, not a private madness, but a universal condition. Yalom recounts one particularly striking case of a man who had lost his wife. Overwhelmed by grief and by his own fear of dying, the man initially resisted speaking of death. Slowly, through the therapeutic relationship, he began to articulate his dread. What emerged was not only fear, but also longing to live more fully, to connect more deeply with his children, to make peace with the finite time he had left. The therapy did not remove his mortality, but it transformed his relationship with it. He left not with certainty, but with courage. Ultimately, therapy at the edge of existence is about transformation through truth. It is about helping individuals turn toward what they most fear, not to destroy them, but to free them from the chains of avoidance. Yalom often writes that the idea of death saves us. By acknowledging it, we stop postponing life. By facing it, we see with clarity what matters most. Therapy does not offer immortality, it offers presence. It does not promise eternal life, it offers authentic life. At the edge of existence, therapist and patient meet as equals, two human beings facing the same horizon. In that meeting, where illusions fall away and silence is broken, something extraordinary can happen. Not despair, but renewal. Death remains, but so does life, more vivid, more urgent, and more precious than before. If death is the shadow that follows us, then creativity is the light we cast in response. For Irvin D. Yalom, the confrontation with mortality is not only a source of fear, but also a wellspring of possibility. In Staring at the Sun, he argues that while the inevitability of death can paralyze, it can also awaken us to life. The key lies in how we respond to the shadow. Do we retreat into denial and distraction, or do we transform the awareness of finitude into a catalyst for creativity, connection, and meaning? Creativity, in this sense, is not limited to art, music, or literature, though these are powerful examples. It is any act that affirms life in the face of death. A parent nurturing a child, a teacher inspiring students, a lover writing a letter. These too are creative responses, gestures that declare, even though I will not last forever, I will leave something behind. Yalom suggests that when patients confront death, many discover a hidden drive to create, to give form to something that outlives them, however briefly. In this way, mortality becomes not only a limit, but also a call to action. Ernest Becker described this dynamic vividly in The Denial of Death. For Becker, culture itself is humanity's great creative response to mortality. Every poem, cathedral, symphony, or scientific discovery is in part an attempt to transcend finitude. He called these efforts immortality projects, while Becker warned that such projects can become distorted, fueling wars, ideologies, or destructive quests for power. He also acknowledged their potential for greatness. Human beings, aware of their fragility, create not because they are eternal, but precisely because they are not. Viktor Frankl, too, believed in the transformative potential of finitude. In Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote that death gives life its sharpness, compelling us to act now rather than postpone. He compared life to a play. What matters is not its length, but its depth and authenticity. Creativity, for Frankl, was one of the highest forms of meaning-making. By shaping something that reflects our uniqueness, we respond to mortality not with despair, but with affirmation. Yalom's clinical work offers countless stories of this transformation. He describes patients who, after facing death, began writing memoirs, painting canvases, or composing music. But just as often, their creative response took subtler forms, reconciling with estranged family, planting gardens, mentoring younger colleagues. These acts were not grand gestures of immortality, but intimate affirmations of life. Death had awakened them to the realization that time is limited and therefore too precious to be squandered. But creativity is not only about leaving something behind, it is also about how we live in the present. When individuals face mortality, they often report a heightened sensitivity to beauty, a sunset, a piece of music, the laughter of a child, all take on a new radiance. This attentiveness itself is a creative act, a way of shaping perception. Yalom calls this the gift of finitude, the fact that knowing life will end makes us treasure it more deeply. Creativity, then, is not only about producing, but also about perceiving, savoring, and celebrating. The therapeutic process often seeks to guide patients toward this creative response. Yalom emphasizes that therapy is not about eliminating fear, but about transforming it. When patients realize that death anxiety can be a motivator rather than a prison, they often begin to live differently. They stop postponing, they take risks, they embrace vulnerability. The shadow of death, once paralyzing, becomes a source of light. As Yalom often reminds his readers, though death may be the end of us, it can also be the beginning of us. The creative response also has a communal dimension. Death reminds us of our shared humanity, our common fragility. In acknowledging this, we are moved to connect more deeply with others. Love itself can be seen as a creative act, the weaving of bonds that outlast individual lifespans. To love is to leave an imprint, to shape another life in ways that ripple beyond our own. Yalom observed that many of his patients found solace in recognizing that even after they were gone, their influence, through love, care, and kindness, would endure in the lives of others. In the end, the confrontation with mortality offers us a choice. We can allow the shadow to shrink our lives, to imprison us in fear and denial, or we can turn toward the light, using the shadow itself as a source of contrast that makes life's radiance clearer. Creativity, whether through art, love, or simple acts of presence, becomes the ultimate defiance, a way of saying, yes, death is inevitable, but while I live, I will shape something meaningful. Death is the constant shadow, but it is not the whole picture. By turning to creativity, we discover that finitude is not only a boundary, but also a frame within which beauty, love, and meaning become possible. Without that frame, life would be endless and thus empty. With it, every act of creation, every gesture of love, every moment of awareness becomes luminous. In facing death, we learn not only how to die, but more importantly, how to live. If this journey into the shadow of death and the search for meaning resonated with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel and join a community that dares to face life's deepest questions. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might be the insight someone else needs. And remember, every week we uncover new perspectives that challenge, inspire, and awaken. Stay curious, stay present, and let's walk this path together.